Hello and welcome to Evening. I'm your host, Isra Haidar. Tens of millions of women and girls around the world are employed as domestic workers in private households. They clean, cook, care for children, look after elderly family members. They are among the most exploited and abused workers in the world. They may be locked within their workplace and subject to both physical and sexual violence. More to talk about this issue is Mr. Omar Harfouch, a coordinator at the Migrant Workers Task Force, which is an NGO that supports migrant workers in Lebanon. Also joining us via phone is Mr. Mohammed Kleit, a human rights activist and journalist from Lebanon. In addition to Ms. Rahel Zegeye, who is an Ethiopian activist and worker and will also be joining us via phone. I'd like to welcome our guests, but before we begin, let's take a look at this report.
Domestic workers are among the most abused and exploited workers in the world. With the Domestic Workers Convention now coming into effect, millions of women and girls will have a chance for safer working conditions and better lives. The Domestic Workers Convention number 189, adopted by International Labour Organization members in 2011, set standards for the estimated 50 to 100 million domestic workers worldwide, mostly women and girls, who perform essential household work in private homes. These workers cook, clean, and provide care for children and the elderly, but in many countries are excluded from basic labor law protections. Domestic workers face a wide range of human rights violations, including excessive working hours without rest, non-payment of wages, forced confinement, physical and sexual abuse, forced labor, and trafficking. On this regard, women's rights advocate at Human Rights Watch, Gori Van Gulik, said, "Domestic workers are among the most abused and exploited workers in the world." Under the treaty, domestic workers are entitled to protections available to other workers, including weekly days off, limits to hours of work, and minimum wage and social security coverage. The convention obligates governments to protect domestic workers from violence and abuse, and to prevent child labor in domestic work. It also requires governments to ensure that domestic work by children above the minimum age of employment does not deprive them of compulsory education or interfere with opportunities to participate in further education or vocational training. As of September 2013, 8 countries have led the way by ratifying the Domestic Workers Convention: Bolivia, Italy, Mauritius, Nicaragua, Paraguay, Philippines, South Africa, and Uruguay. Others are taking steps towards ratification. As the treaty enters into force, countries that have ratified are now bound to implement its obligations.
I'd like to welcome our guests once again. Welcome, Mr. Harfouch.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin with you with some statistics regarding the human rights violations that face domestic workers, specifically in Lebanon.
First, there's around 200,000 migrant workers currently based in Lebanon. From different nationalities, being Ethiopian, Philippines, from Madagascar, and from different countries in Africa and Asia. Currently, some shocking numbers that were published from Human Rights Watch that estimated that 1 death per week occur within migrant domestic workers from unnatural causes. That could be from suicides, or that could be from homicides that are not reported. As well, we have, in Lebanon at least, there's a lot of inequality when it comes to decisions within, to do legal decisions. We have around 13 criminal cases that were reviewed by Human Rights Watch, and that saw that all those criminal cases of violence and abuse were all punished lightly. The harshest punishment was 1 month of prison for beating repetitively a migrant domestic worker.
And if this act of beating the domestic worker was committed towards a normal human being in terms of someone from the nationality of this country, would he have received a different punishment? Would it have been the same?
Definitely. Violence is currently punished within 6 months and above in Lebanon. Plus, we have around 114 other legal decisions that were all taken against the migrant domestic workers. When I say these are working conditions, migrant domestic workers who did not have their passports, others who did not have who were not paid their wages, and all of these. None had their rights taken back. Even people who had worked for years and many years without being paid, they weren't paid back.
And is it safe to say that this situation of domestic workers in Lebanon can can be or is replicated in other countries in the region, or is it only severe to Lebanon itself?
Definitely, we can see the same pattern repeating itself within the Middle East, within different Arab countries as well. We have a lot of also sexual abuse in all these countries, a lot of violence, and definitely a lot of imprisonment within the house. Very few, I would say 90%, don't get a day off, and even those who get days off, they are locked in within the houses and not allowed to go outside.
I'm glad you mentioned the day off, because I'd like to also discuss with you some other human rights violations or work violations. They are employees at the end of the day, and is this something that most people don't understand, that they are not employees, they see them as something differently?
I mean, one, they're working within the household, so it makes it much harder to apply these legal rules or these work laws on them.
Because they're in the house.
They're working within the house.
With the family.
For example, there's a law that limits their hours of work to a maximum of 10 hours per day. But then, since they're in the house, the employers don't understand that after these 10 hours, I'm not working anymore. So they will call them, they're repetitively, like it's like they're on call constantly.
24 hours.
24 hours plus 7 days a week.
Okay.
I mean, you're not allowed to go out, especially within the sponsorship system that we'll talk about later on.
Okay.
So
this is the first violation, not respecting working hours.
Not respecting working hours.
Not receiving a day off.
Others, there's a lot of migrant domestic workers who don't get paid their wages, or at least there's a big delay within the payment of the wages. And if you want to follow up on this within the people who are responsible for it, there is no good follow-up on this, and it takes around 2 years, for example, for a final judicial decision to come up. So and mostly it's against the migrant domestic worker, and they don't give them back their
And
rights.
how is it that these laws that are in place are not being implemented correctly? Why is it that these domestic workers cannot go and report what happened to them and say that I have been abused, I have faced sexual abuse, or I'm not receiving my payment? Is it because they can't go out of their house, they're locked? Don't they have embassies that could protect them?
Definitely a lot of them, well, those who can at least, those who run away after being having many violations against them, because again the sponsorship system links the sponsor to the domestic worker. So the only way to terminate the contract is within the agreement of the sponsor.
Okay, so this sponsorship system, which you're talking about, Mr. Harfouch, and you're an expert in migrant domestic workers issues, does it apply only to Lebanon? And I'd like to go into the details of it. How does it work, and how does it force the domestic migrant worker to work in certain conditions?
So one, it applies in many other countries, in many other Arab countries than Lebanon. And it links one sponsor to this migrant domestic worker. This sponsor is responsible to everything related to this migrant domestic worker. And a lot of sponsors and employers don't allow these domestic workers to go out of their households, for example, because they're scared. Because they fear that anything might happen to them. At the end, they're under their protection. It's like a father protecting another person, even though sometimes this other person is 40 years old or 30 years old. And I mean, they're responsible for, they can take responsibility for their own
And does
actions.
this sponsorship system, you mentioned that it's applied in other countries. Is it also applied in the Gulf region as well?
Yeah, definitely, in the Gulf region and Lebanon.
Okay.
And I want to take this chance to mention that Lebanon and many Gulf countries like Kuwait and KSA are all on a blacklist. On a blacklist.
On a blacklist of who?
On a blacklist of countries that are not allowed to have migrant domestic workers recruited to these countries.
So Bangladesh or Ethiopia or the Philippines would come and say, I will not send my residents to these countries.
Exactly, that is exactly what happened.
But then how can we explain the presence of Filipinos and Ethiopians and
so there's a lot of recruitment
in these countries?
There's a lot of recruitment agencies
who
are bringing these migrant domestic workers illegally. Plus the welcoming countries are accepting visa applications, work visa applications from these countries. So the ban is definitely not applied.
But are the workers themselves aware that it's illegal for them to come, or that their countries have put the receiving countries on the blacklist, or they're unaware?
Sometimes they're pushed by the recruitment agencies. They're lured in by the recruitment agencies. Plus, we can't forget that these are people from very poor countries. A lot of times coming from very rural areas, very poor areas. So they don't really know of what's happening. And they think that what awaits them here is heaven.
Okay.
And then when they come here, they see that it's a very different case.
So going back to the sponsorship system, they're only responsible, one sponsor is responsible for this domestic migrant worker. Can a sponsor be responsible for more than one domestic worker?
It depends on each person. Plus, I mean, usually it's the two employers, one the male part of the family and the female part of the family.
And they take control of the domestic workers' visa, passport, payment, healthcare. They're responsible for everything?
They're basically responsible for everything. It's like someone is owning a person. So it's like just something that you own in your house. Your TV, your refrigerator, it's like you're having someone working for you in your house under your name.
Which is why it's such a human rights violation.
Definitely. It enters within the trafficking. I mean, plus there's a lot of misconceptions within the system. For example, some migrant workers are signing on different contracts at their homes, and then they come here and they find a total different environment ready for them.
Okay.
You have people who signed for 2 years, they come here, they work for 3 years. In a lot of cases, they sign for a much higher pay and they get paid much less.
Well, it seems very dramatic and very violating the basic human rights of any individual. I don't want to jump right now to what are the results or what are some of the answers and issues that we could resolve, but I'd like to understand more the role of the sending countries. These countries have blacklisted other countries, and yet we still find some countries who are accepting to send their individuals and their citizens to countries where they're being abused. Why would countries do that?
Okay, so the sending countries, there's a lot of bans that are published, but they're not really applied on the ground. There's not very good awareness systems. They're not observing if any workers are still leaving their countries. Plus, the embassies here are really weak when it comes to these issues. Especially, I can speak of the Ethiopian embassy, for example, that doesn't protect a big number of its citizens living here.
But why, Mr. Harfouch, would they protect them? Is it related to international politics, to international relations? Do they look at domestic workers as lower individuals and therefore they believe that we have more important things to take care of?
The sending countries actually benefit from these domestic workers.
The amount of money that they send
back to the homes, they're the ones that are responsible for making the economy work. But they just think that there's more. I mean, a big part of it is because of the corruption system. A lot of these countries are also corrupted. But so they basically don't have time for these issues. They're busy working on other issues, while their main focus should be on the citizens.
So what happens when a domestic worker decides to run away after she's being abused? But at the same time, I don't want to be biased towards the domestic workers. We've heard a lot of stories, Mr. Harfouch, about domestic workers who have run away from employers who were actually good to them and kind, and they've just ran away for reasons which we don't know. So how much is there an exaggeration in the issue? And my second question is, what happens when they do run away?
So definitely, one, there's always the rule and there's exceptions. There's always the majority and there's the minority. I think the minority is the ones that are running away from good employers. In the majority of cases, it's either people who run away from abuse, people who run away from not being paid. There's a lot of people who are banned from food. They're not allowed to eat within the households. And then you have people who kill themselves, who commit suicide because of they can't take all this imprisonment anymore. So I think this is the majority, and the minority are the ones who are running away from good work environments. When it comes to why are these people, what happens to them after they run away? One, there are NGOs that can help out within the system. Otherwise, if they can't find an NGO to help them, they basically they're living here illegally. Because if you're not related to your sponsor can report you, and then automatically you become the criminal.
Okay.
You become the illegal one, even though you haven't done anything wrong.
But when most domestic workers fled away to their embassies, their employers usually have their passports or their identification papers. So what happens in this case? How does she resolve it?
So sometimes they go to the embassies and the embassies have no answers to them. They just let them go back on the streets. Sometimes they try to go back even to the general security, to the responsible forces. And in case they want to send them back home, they lock them in prison, and the prison in Lebanon for migrants in general has very inhuman conditions.
So they're treated as prisoners as
prisoners while waiting to be deported.
When the truth is that they were flooding away. They were victims of abuse, and so they're treated as prisoners.
They're treated as prisoners unless there's someone to put them under their name as a sponsor.
Which is a very complicated technical process.
Definitely. I mean, if I'm a sponsor that I want to take another domestic worker that's not under my name, I have to pay a big amount of money to take her, and I have to get, again, the approval of the original sponsor, who is, in this case, the abuser. So it's a very difficult system, because the abuser usually doesn't want to give someone who is now stabbing them in the back, who ran away from them, their
Which
rights.
is a complicated issue.
Exactly.
What needs to be done in order to protect domestic workers in Lebanon and worldwide is what we'll be discussing after the break. Please stay tuned.
Around the world, outside the mainstream, anywhere, everywhere. A media of your land, of your creation. A new media in a new era. Will it take the lead in the future? I believe so. This is Underground.
Underground, when vague turns to clarity.
Welcome back. Domestic workers is what we're talking about today. And with us here in the studio is Mr. Omar Harfouch, who is a specialist in migrant worker issues and the coordinator of the Migrant Task Force organization. Welcome, Mr. Harfouch, once again. Before the break, we were talking about the situations when domestic workers run away or flee from their employers because they are victims of abuse. And we didn't reach any conclusion as to what happens to these domestic workers. So what are the steps that domestic workers need to take in order to run away in the right manner to ensure that they're receiving their rights?
Definitely. One, I'm turning my papers to see the numbers. We have a very important case of how to report an abuse. There are general tips how to report an abuse, at least if you're in Lebanon. And in case a migrant worker flees their employers, also what to do. There are certain NGOs in Lebanon. We have Kafa, we have Caritas.
Mr. Harfouch, can we take these NGOs and the numbers, all of them in details, after we take this phone call?
Definitely.
We have with us over the phone Mr. Mohammed, who is a journalist and a human rights activist. Welcome, Mr. Kleit.
Hello, sir.
Welcome. Mr. Kleit, I'd like to start off with you by discussing the laws that protect domestic workers. And we have the Domestic Workers Convention, which was adopted in June 2011. And it is the first global platform to protect these workers. What are your thoughts about this convention, and how applicable will it be to countries such as Lebanon and the Middle East?
Well, I would like to start off the ILO, the International Labour Organization, was part of this convention and did not place laws to impose on countries that agreed on the recommendations, because in the end there are local laws for each country, such as the Arab Gulf and Lebanon specifically. The ILO placed such recommendations such as to eliminate obstacles of employment and discrimination, and to place insurance for workers and medical tests and so on. But if you see at Lebanon, in 2005, the General Security Committee placed certain laws on housemaids that the employers employ. And they are to respect Lebanese laws and the family of the workplace, to adapt with the family and their way of living, and also to adapt with the workplace, and to ensure that nothing in the workplace is missing, such as they should not steal and so on.
So is this convention just ink on paper? Does it have no relevance? Relevance to Lebanon or the Middle East?
Not at all, because in the end we have local laws in Lebanon and in the Arab Gulf that contradict a lot with what the ILO has recommended. I actually marked one of the General Security communique in Lebanon that the housemaid should not leave the employer's house without consent of the employer or the agency and go work in another place. So with this, the employer can confiscate a maid's passport and identification card, and at the same time can confine the housemaid inside the house of the employer. So it's kind of like Lebanon is working on the same kafala system that the Arab
sponsorship system. Mr. Kleit, please stay with us. Mr. Harfouch, are these domestic workers aware of the laws that should protect them to a certain extent, and who educates them about these issues? Do they receive certain contracts, or do they read or write any documents that tell them what they should be receiving, and how are they educated about these laws?
Actually, they are not educated about these laws. As I said, the recruitment agencies in their countries lure them in. They trick them into a lot of contracts, signing a lot of contracts that don't even exist. The employers here sign on different contracts. Even now, in Lebanon, for example, now we have a unified contract that was applied around 2 years ago. And it's only in Arabic. I mean, these domestic workers coming from different countries don't know how to speak Arabic, definitely not read it. And the translators are not always there, so they're signing on something that they don't even know what they're signing on. They're not educated at all. The NGOs now in Lebanon try to do a lot of
legal consultations, definitely a lot of awareness to these different populations, but still there's a long way ahead. Way to go. Mr. Kleit, what happens when domestic workers go to the certain country and want to be protected by the labor laws that are offered by this country? Can this situation be applicable?
Well, you gotta see now what the embassies of those certain countries are doing in the local countries that the housemaids are going to. I remember in 1989, if I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, a Filipino housemaid complained against her embassy because the embassy was supporting the agencies against Filipino workers. And most of the time, these housemaids are committing suicide. The peak of suicide rates on housemaid was in 2007. At the same time, I can like.
So she complained against her embassy.
Exactly.
To the Lebanese government.
Exactly.
And what happened after that?
Well, nothing. The embassy did not do anything, and in the end, I mean, Lebanon, the Lebanese government will go in favor of the Lebanese community and its citizens. It won't go in favor of a housemaid. And a year before, as well, in 1997. Sushar Rutki was Sri Lanka. In 2005, Sushar Rutki, who was Sri Lanka, hung herself from a balcony in Zegeye because after 20 days of starting off work, because the working conditions were horrible and she was being abused physically and psychologically. There were no investigations whatsoever from Sri Lanka or from the Lebanese government on that case. In the end, if I can comment on what your guest has said, yes, there's a huge amount of discrimination against housemaids because the agreement only happens between the employer and the importing agency. You can say that. So what I'm saying that the maids or the workers do not get any consent, or they don't have anything to say about the agreement that happens between both sides. Both sides agree on what she's going to get paid for and all that, but the housemaid is not part of the deal. She just has to work.
Mr. Harfouch, when we're talking about domestic workers, and we've talked about how severe their situation is in Lebanon, are there certain countries where domestic workers are respected, where they don't face violence, where they don't face racism, and they do have good working conditions?
Definitely, you have to think outside the sponsorship system. There's a lot of countries that don't apply this system, and this at least gives the worker a chance to be equal to their employer when it comes to the legal system. that as a first step. And in that case, they're not linked to one person. I mean, if you want to terminate your own contract because of bad working environment, you can go to the law and just file a complaint like anyone else in any other work. And
let's take Mr. Kleit's perspective on terminating their contract. Mr. Kleit, what would happen if domestic workers united and decided they wanted to terminate their contracts because of bad working conditions, because of the violence and the racism that they're facing?
I believe last year something like that happened. There was a huge crowd of domestic workers revolting against their employers. If I could say, there was the most beautiful protest. It was all colors, it was all spiritual cultures out there on the streets. But at the same time, as ILO considers it that domestic workers are the most vulnerable workforce in the world because they're being physically and psychologically abused all over the world. There are some exceptions in certain countries that follow democratic rule, also in households. But in Lebanon, it's kind of hard because in the end, even the Lebanese people, when they go out on the streets and protest in order to gain their own rights, and they have a priority. They're the priority of the Lebanese government. How would workforces such as housemaids, how would the government react to the housemaids if they are asking for their own rights? I think they're out of their list even.
Mr. Kleit, my final question to you is, as a journalist, what role does the media have in promoting and raising awareness about such issues?
Thank God the Lebanese media at some point is working for the housemaids. We find a lot of activists that are doing certain stuff, and lots of journalists have this activist spirit in them, and they do not abide by discrimination that the Lebanese community mostly have. Because they have this sense of awareness against discrimination, and I think that media personnel should adopt this sense of anti-discrimination in order to help not only housing but every workforce that's being discriminated against.
Mr. Mohammed Kleit, a human rights activist and journalist, I'd like to thank you so much for your valuable information.
You're welcome.
Mr. Harfouch, your comments on...
I'd like to add, actually, the media has played for a very long time a big negative part in the
So you disagree with what Mr. Kleit just discussed?
No, I agree that now there's some change, but still the media should change much more. The media at some point really encouraged discrimination against these domestic workers.
And how would they do that? And I think it's important to explain it to the viewers, because just talking abstract subjects might not be very clear.
Definitely.
So how did the media manipulate?
Everything we've seen in the different media in Lebanon and the Middle East, they concentrate on the small violations that happen. This domestic worker pushed a small kid outside the balcony, and that's like one case in 10 years. While once per week you have a domestic worker who is committing suicide,
and it goes unreported.
And it goes unreported within the media. They're always focused on the bad side of domestic workers, but I think, in any country you have good workers and you have bad workers. No one ever talks about the violations that happen against the good workers. Everybody's always talking about the theft, about the threats, but no one talks about the daily abuse that happens against domestic workers.
Talking about the media, Mr. Harfouch, the Migrant Task Force organization which you're working in is empowering domestic workers to create their own media. If you could tell us more about this, and how are you empowering domestic workers?
We are working we're giving classes to different domestic workers and different migrant workers for English and French and computer, so that we want them themselves to be able to use social media and different ways of communication to be able to express themselves and express the stories that they know of different migrant workers that they know.
So they're creating their own media in terms of social media platforms.
Exactly.
So are they creating videos? Are they creating blogs to share them on these social media platforms to tell their stories?
We've had a case of Alan de Chassa, and there's a video that was published publicly and that was reported that showed the violations, that showed her employer hitting her. And after a week, the news reported that she hung herself at a psychiatric hospital in Lebanon. After seeing her beaten up, the judiciary system did nothing, but still our own students had something to say, especially because a lot of them already know her. So we had a video about a small message from different domestic workers to the government about how they should proceed with the
and how important is it that they are documenting their stories, that they are writing what is going on, because most of the times we realize that there is no proof of what they're saying. Is this one of the reasons to why you've decided to empower them in terms of using social media and learning English language and learning how to use a computer to create proof?
Definitely. We want to create all the stories to be reported, and once we have the stories documented, we can move forward and well, mostly it's awareness to the public to see all the violations that are happening, and at the same time we can take these stories and to the government and to the responsible forces to push for change.
And we've talked about the subject of domestic workers from a perspective where we have the employer and the employee. What about the community as a whole? What about schools? What about universities? Does your organization or other NGOs, and you were talking about some NGOs before we took the phone call with Mr. Kleit, do they promote or raise awareness about how to treat domestic workers and their rights and the issues that they should receive?
Definitely. There's different organizations that work on education of the general population. You have the anti-racism movement that works on different topics and different subjects to raise awareness within the community itself. Plus, I think the most important part and the change that needs to happen most is within the racism that a lot of people have, especially in Lebanon. You have, and in different countries, you have people considering themselves higher than these individuals just because they're coming from poor countries, just because they're coming to work for them. They consider themselves at a higher base. No one's looking at all humans on the same level.
Okay.
And this is definitely due to racism. A lot of changes is happening in different schools, but definitely there's also much more change.
And how are you creating these programs? Do you go about telling them about the rights of domestic workers? Do you bring domestic workers to communicate with children at schools or students at universities?
I mean, the different topics that are held are just from smallest things like different lecture books or the readings that they have within the schools to discuss that these people who are from different skin color are equal to us. These people who are working and who come here and leave their families are here just to serve us and to help us. So we have to treat them equally. We have to treat them well, at least. I mean, we have to take into consideration their conditions.
Another issue which is very important for domestic workers is their day off. And in Lebanon, there was the issue of domestic workers entering into public beaches or private beaches. And what are your thoughts about this issue? They were prevented from going in. There was a hidden camera issue. If you could tell us more about this issue.
So this was raised also by anti-racism movement, where they had one of Rahel, Zegeye, actually, the one that we're going to be
talking with in
a few minutes. She went and tried to go into a private beach. She was ready to pay the amount that she needs to pay to go in, but she was not allowed in. This is not only the cases of beaches, also the cases of different restaurants.
Simply because she had a different skin color, or was it because she was a domestic worker?
Well, nothing shows on a person that they're domestic workers. They're just for different skin color, and even maybe sometimes it's either African or Asian. And like a big mistake happened also as well when they refused, they denied access to the wife of the Taiwanese ambassador to go into a private beach. And that was really something that raised the alarm that something is going wrong. In Lebanon, actually, a law banning this discriminatory actions was made for different beaches. Any beach that does not allow workers or different people from different color of skin would be shut down.
After the break, we'll be having a phone call with an Ethiopian activist, Ms. Rahel Zegeye, who will be telling us about her story and how she empowered other domestic workers. Please stay tuned.
Pollution and climate change, medicine manipulation, genetically modified food, the destruction of wildlife, and corporate exploitation. These are all part of the new terrorism threatening our future.
Eco-terrorism, global awakening to a world under threat.
Welcome back. Mr. Harfouch, before the break we were talking about the laws and the regulations that are preventing migrant workers from actually having access to their rights, and we were giving the example of entering the beach. How can migrant domestic workers work together to promote their rights? What can they do to mobilize themselves in order to work in countries and yet receive their basic human rights?
Okay, so one, they need to be aware, and this is what we're doing as an organization, also with Rahel. We want to spread awareness within these countries for people who want to come to Lebanon, to different countries, to know what to expect. Because a lot of people, as I said, don't know, and some of them think that they're coming to heaven and they're going to get a lot of money, and at the same time they get
they're surprised.
They're surprised. So what we want to do in this movie is to spread awareness, to show the reality.
So this is a movie that the Migrant Task Force
Migrant Worker Task Force is working
organizing
on with Rahel Zegeye. It's actually written by her.
So the Ethiopian activist, she is writing the movie with you, with yourself.
We're writing this movie together, and we actually trained a lot of migrant domestic workers and also people from Lebanon to show the reality of how these domestic workers are treated in Lebanon. As I said, the media has shown a lot of misconceptions.
So you're creating your own media.
No, exactly. So now we want to show the truth, the reality. And we want to spread this movie in different countries, the countries that these domestic workers are coming from, so that they would know what to expect.
And is it based on true stories, or is it written?
It is based on true stories of violence, of sexual abuse, of rape, of people not being paid, and of being locked in, and also of people who ran away and how did they follow up within their lives of living illegally in a country.
So how are you going to spread awareness about this movie, and what are some of the things that you're going to do to make sure that people really watch it?
Well, once we're done with the movie, we're gonna implement it in different countries. As I said, in Ethiopia, for sure, because Rahel has contacts there, and I mean, it's not going to be also paid in these countries. We want them just to come and see, and we also want to put it in Lebanon so that the Lebanese population would know the truth and the reality of these people and the suffering of these workers. We also want to go with it internationally. I mean, it's not only documentary; it's also fiction, and it's made artistically, I would say. So it's also a movie for people to go and watch and enjoy. Plus,
you mentioned that some of the stories that are included in the movie is when women or domestic workers are forced to live in a country illegally. What happens to women when their passports are with their sponsors and their embassy is not supporting them? What happens in this situation? Because I feel that we still didn't find a solution, or we didn't cover it properly.
Definitely. One, you have to keep in mind that they're living illegally. They have all the doors closed in front of them. They can't work anywhere else. You have either people who come and abuse them, people who open houses to them and just tell them, okay, you go work for a very ridiculous amount of money for 2 or 3 hours at this household and clean. And other people force them into prostitution, into sex work.
They abuse their situation.
Exactly, they abuse their situation because these people, they can't go back home. They have no money to buy tickets. And if they're caught by the police, they definitely will be put in a jail that, as I said, is inhuman conditions.
With us over the phone is Ethiopian activist Ms. Rahel Zegeye. Welcome, Ms. Zegeye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome, and we're very happy to have you on the show.
Me also.
Ms. Zegeye, could you please tell us a little bit of the activities and the events that you've done and how you were able to help other domestic workers in promoting their stories and fighting for their rights?
Oh, okay. You hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Ms. Zegeye.
Okay. I helping for another domestic workers because of I have time. I have time here. My boss is give me my time. Everywhere I go, I will see every Ethiopian girl, every another country girls also. This is my point, Anna.
So because you have time, you're able to communicate to other domestic workers what their rights are and to explain to them these issues.
Yeah.
And what are some of the activities that you've been doing outside of your employment contract? Do you have any workshops that you do? Do you go out with your friends? How is your life outside of your job?
Outside my job, I have communicated with Ethiopian girls. I have also the group for theater, drama, for something, some NGO programs.
We have a group to train workers on acting.
So you're working on several subjects in order to empower these workers.
Yes.
Ms. Zegeye, what are your
please give me again this question.
What are your final recommendations? What advice do you have for other domestic workers and for employers in order to make sure that both parties are receiving their rights?
What do you want to say to the Lebanese community?
What do you want to say to the Lebanese employers? What do you want to say to the Lebanese domestic workers?
Yeah, okay. The Lebanese employer, please, for girls inside house, especially some people, not all, some people, maximum net take it 20%. 20% people you don't give food, you don't give salary, you don't treat poor girls. Please take care of girls because she is working with Lebanese people. She's right hand. Take care of poor girls like the daughter. And it's the human right.
They're treating them as their own daughters.
Oh yeah. Second, the girls. She say girls helping for employer. Maybe the employer is upset. The employer is sick. The employer is wrong. She give for him treat, for her, for madam give treating. But especially, I think so, especially the employer is pushing for girls. Serious. No, the girl she's working. Yes. She don't have any power. She talk about something.
Ms. Rahel Zegeye, I'd like to thank you so much for all of the valuable information you've given us. Your input was very, very important to us on the show, and I wish you all the best in supporting other domestic workers in Lebanon and abroad, and I truly wish you all the best. Thank you so much for your contribution.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And we apologize. Thank you. We apologize to our viewers if some of what Ms. Rahel mentioned was not unclear, but we really wanted her input because I think it's important to embrace what domestic workers truly have to say. Mr. Harfouch, your comments on what Ms. Zegeye said, and she focused on a very important issue, which is the psychological aspect. We talked about physical abuse, we talked about holidays and compensation, but we did not really focus on the psychological issues and the psychological problems that face these workers.
Well, they're not, as I said, they're not treated as equals. There's a lot of discrimination against them, not only within their households, but like at every turn. If they go on the street, any girl that's going on the street, she's going to be harassed by people. She's going to be...
Even on her day off...
Even on her day off, she does not get to enjoy it because there's a lot of discrimination, a lot of racism happening on the street, in the household. So it's a very complicated situation to these people. Plus, those who are, I mean, some people treat their domestic workers nicely, but they're still locked in. For example, if you're locked in a house, you can't go out of a household for 3 years. That's about to drive you insane, right? So a lot of cases end up either with mental problems, with psychiatric
problems,
as you mentioned, or suicide. So this is a very important aspect that is usually not tackled, but it has a very negative effect on.
And who
on
should
these
be
workers.
tackling this issue? NGOs are focusing on education and computer skills and English. What about the psychological treatment?
Definitely no. NGOs actually have a lot of counseling for domestic workers, especially domestic workers who are being abused. They help them, one, to run away, and two, they also have shelters for them, safe spaces for these individuals. And later on, they try to follow up with the employer in order to either get the proper rights for these domestic workers again.
But do they see counselors or
definitely social workers and counselors are available at these NGOs, but you have to keep in mind that this is only to the people that are able to reach. A lot of people are just suffering silently, and they will never be able to go out and express their opinions.
Mr. Harfouch, from your experience and from your insights on the issue, are there any laws in the making in the near future that are being created to protect domestic workers, not only domestic workers, but migrant workers as well?
Well, we've spoken before about the international labor law that should be applied, but as we said, it's only ink on paper, so it's not going to cause much change. In Lebanon, a little change was noticed 2 years ago. In 2011, there was something called the unified contract that limited the hours of work within 10 hours, that said that every domestic worker should have 1 day off per week and 6 days off per year. But this is not really applied.
6 days off as compared to 1 month for a normal worker?
For a normal worker.
Is it because they're domestic workers?
This has to be, well, this is definitely...
It's a legal issue.
It's a legal issue. There's a lot of discrimination. But even in the contract, they say that the worker cannot get out of the household unless she takes permission of her sponsor.
My final question to you, Mr. Kleit, is how can domestic workers raise their voices? Are there certain numbers that they can call? Are there certain NGOs that they can contact in order to protect their rights?
Definitely. One, there's different NGOs, and also for people who see abuse and want to report it. One, you have to make sure that the domestic worker is not feeling, not to scare her, not to make her feel
intimidated.
Guilty. Exactly. Two, you have to take her name, you have to take the employer's name, and you can call different NGOs like CAFA that can offer legal services on their hotline 76090910.
This is for Lebanon?
This is for Lebanon.
Okay.
And also they can ensure safe spaces to these people, and they can help them. They can help her even run away and put them in a safe space, as long as there is. But they will also need proof to later go on to the court with it.
Could you just repeat the number, because
Definitely.
we're out of time, just to make sure that our viewers have access to it?
Okay, so it's the Lebanese code +961. Then there's 76090910.
With that, I'd like to conclude with you, Mr. Harfouch. Thank you so much for all of the information that you gave us today. And I'd also like to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. And don't forget to tune in next week. Take care.